It's my great pleasure to meet virtually and introduce Professor Josh Grace. Dr. Josh Grace is Associate Professor of African History and is currently at McClelland. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Is currently a McClelland Faculty Fellow in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina. His work explores the intersection of technology and development in African history. It tackles a common stereotype about the continent's past, that its societies lack development because they historically have not had the technology or knowledge societies that those in the global north possess. Professor Grace debunks this myth by using hundreds of oral histories in Kiswahili. His apprenticeship as an automobile repair shop an automobile repair shop in Dar es Salaam, and archives in East Africa and the United Kingdom. His book, African Motives, Technology, Gender, I didn't know I was a host as well. His book, African Motors, Technology, Gender, and the History of Development in Tanzania, published by Duke University Press in 2021, demonstrates that Africans have shaped car designs and a motor vehicle culture since the early 1900s. He argues that the fact that East African societies have these cultures of mobility and mechanical expertise should reshape assumptions about which societies hold useful knowledge for pursuing economic development or more sustainable societies. In addition, Professor Grace has completed research for a second book project entitled Global Maroons, Slavery and Refuge in an Indian Ocean World Today. In an Indian Ocean World History. It comprises over 150 oral interviews of Zigula speakers taken as slaves from present-day Tanzania to present-day Somalia around the turn of the 19th century. These Zigula people subsequently escaped and helped establish a large Maroon community. The monograph builds on Neil Roberts' theory of freedom as Maroonage to show how 19th century stories about slavery, escape, political formation, and conversion to Islam provided a template for Zigula communities to navigate the colonial and post-colonial eras, as well as their more recent diaspora to Kenya, Tanzania, and the United States through refugee resettlement. Professor Grace's research has received support from the American Council for Learned Societies, Fulbright, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation. Professor Grace currently serves as the Director of Latin American Studies Program and the African Studies Program. Wow. Not sure how you can do that. For the Walker Institute for International and Area Studies, and has just started the term as President for the Tanzanian Studies Association. Today's talk, Cars After Tanzanian Socialism, or Were There Historical Alternatives to Self-Devouring Automobility, stems from a second book-length project that seeks to examine the impact of privatization policies on Tanzania repair shops since the late 1970s. As global societies grapple with the environmental limits of car-based livelihoods, this project aims to explore the more sustainable livelihoods Tanzanian mechanics created during the periods of shortage through reuse and modification. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Josh Grace.
Much, Luis. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay.
Please do.
One of those things where I have so many windows open, finding the right one.
Yeah, I see what you're
It's way harder than it should be. Let me just get out of some stuff real quickly.
All right. Oh, sure.
Actually, it changed when he started sharing.
Oh, okay.
Exactly, so we could focus on.
Okay, perfect. Perfect.
All right, I think I can see it up. Oh, that's not the right slide, but otherwise it is up. All right.
Right.
Thank you all so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. Thank you to Jackie for the initial invitation, for Luis for organizing, and to Lexi for the coolest flyer that I'm ever going to get. I'm going to blow it up. It's going to be on my wall. So I know you all have some other commitments today, so I'm going to jump right into this. This talk is a thinking out at the end of a book and the beginning of something else, somewhere in between those things. And so it's called Cars After Tanzanian Socialism, or Were There Historical Alternatives to Self-Devouring Automobility? I'm going to depart from two main questions, which is, how does the search for socialist technological alternatives to development in Tanzania shape histories? Sometimes we call it the history of sustainability, but really it's the history of unsustainability as emergent historiography. And then how might socialist histories of motoring, specifically from Tanzania, inform history is written in increasingly unsustainable times? Obviously, unsustainability has a long, long history, but certainly there seems to be the notion that we are writing in the midst of increasing spiraling amounts of unsustainability. So the talk structure, we'll talk about motoring out of time as a sort of long intro to what I'm getting at and what I've written. I'll then talk about the socialist tensions of automobility, specifically centering why Tanzanian socialism and Tanzanian automobility matters to answering these questions. And then I'll give 3 examples, and the 3rd example will go into a conclusion. Okay. This is a book talk of sorts. This book came out a couple of years ago, and I'm still figuring out the things I liked and didn't like about it, and how I'm going to pivot from that to continue working on some of these topics. And so today I'm going to cover really 2 chapters and a little bit of a 4th chapter. So what is here, Overhaul, Chapter 2, The People's Car, Chapter 3, and a little bit of Oili Ujamaa as a way to sort of move into a sort of conclusion for the talk. And instead of privileging the introduction, I am going to talk about these issues from the conclusion: motoring out of time, Tanzanian automobility in unsustainable times, to present some of the things I'm thinking about and sort of move from where I finished with the book. I do so with 2 main aims in mind. The first is to examine some potential historical alternatives to the self-devouring automobility that has shaped world history for at least the last 4 decades. And by automobility, I mean all of the forms of labor, the energy, the technological systems that go into producing forms of fossil fuel movements that are rooted in consumption and mobility. And so I'll talk a bit more about some of that toward the end, but it is, I think, uncontestedly a form of unsustainable livelihood. And I sometimes pull from Julie Livingston's Self-Devouring Growth to talk about self-devouring automobility. So I first want to explore some historical alternatives to that and think that out through Tanzania's period of socialism, which is called Ujamaa, sort of a shorthand for familyhood. And then the second thing is to place specific elements of Tanzania's motoring past in a changing geopolitical context of automobility and sustainability. Unlike much of the 20th and then a little bit of the early 21st century, the creation and maintenance of national cultures of motoring no longer counts as indisputable evidence of successful modernization. The world has simply run out of time for fossil fuel-based mobilities to exist at their current scale, let alone expand as they are in much of the world. In 2007, transport accounted for about 23% of energy-related greenhouse gases. This has reduced even as greenhouse gases have grown, but the sort of transport part has reduced in relation to automobiles. At that time, in 2007, automobiles produced about 75% of these gases for transport, in addition to having a high annual growth rate each year. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, a project of the United Nations Environment Program, and the World Meteorological Organization, identified at least 2 worrisome aspects of this 23%. First, international institutions and nations do not have a theory of growth capable of operating without continuous fossil fuel movements, a form of what Julie Livingston has called self-devouring growth. And the second issue concerns automobility's known destructiveness, or as they put it in the report, quote, "The world is not yet fully motorized because of low incomes. If and when these lower income areas develop and their populations and incomes rise, the prospect for a vast expansion of motorization and the increase in fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions is very real," end quote. Car ownership levels in fast-growing countries like India and China are nowhere close to per capita ownership in the United States. But the expanding geography of ownership has produced profound results. Though it took over a century, from the late 1800s to 2010, to reach the first billion automobiles, we are predicted to either reach 2 billion sometime in the next 10 years, or we might have already reached that The sort of more radical expectation was it would hit sometime around 2020. Likely taking only a quarter of the time to reach the next billion as it did the first billion. As you probably know, the first billion is predominantly located in an area sometimes known as the global north, and this growth in terms of automobility was for centuries described as a form of vitality, social health, and technical sophistication, right? Sort of the root of development progress narratives. The second billion, spurred by expanding geographies of ownership elsewhere in the world, has magnified in the environmental dread that arrived only at the end of reaching the first billion. Even as time runs out to reverse emissions trends, more people than ever are using motor vehicles. In this context, places like Tanzania that combine low overall ownership rates with higher rates of automobile growth in recent decades have become disproportionately visible in discussions of both mobility and sustainability. A major concern about this growth pertains to projections about how this growth in motor vehicle rates will occur in the Global South. Increased car consumption in the Global South, climate experts fear has and will involve used vehicles in places that not only are experiencing high rates of urbanization, but also have less regulated economies and cultures of technology use. I should say here, of course, as any number of scandals from North America and Europe, I'm thinking mostly the Volkswagen emissions scandal shows northern practices provide a poor foil to the supposedly dirtier and more harmful southern vernaculars. More important to the point at hand, many of the specific environmental fears about climate change and motorization in Tanzania started to become a reality through the structural adjustment policies created and implemented by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund beginning in the early to mid-1980s, in direct opposition to Ujamaa, Tanzanian socialism's transport policies. After 1985, World Bank-led privatization brought regional extensions of asphalt roads and paved the way for huge growth in car importation that continues generally up to today. And yet, as Thomas Lecan shows, when President Jakaya Kikwete approved the construction of a hard-packed, not asphalt, but hard-packed road through the Serengeti from Arusha to Musoma, a request that was made by the communities who lived in and near the park, Northern conservationists protested the possibility of a game park becoming more motorized. Importantly, the same outrage that applied to the Serengeti Road has not been aimed at the removal of the regulatory apparatus from Ujamaa that limited car ownership and importation through extended periods of Tanzania's independent and socialist period. Private ownership, and this is just a graph sort of breaking down what you just saw, but I'll note that the 1970 spike in emissions there sort of gives us a timeline of the OPEC oil crisis. And then we see Tanzania's sort of ways of working through that, including some of the issues that I'll bring out in this talk. Private ownership grew slowly during the 1980s, returning to the 1960s levels of importation before taking off in the late 1990s and early 2000s, reaching an estimated 380,000 registered vehicles in 2007. Some estimates suggest Dar es Salaam's vehicle fleet tripled during the 2000s, with national growth rates reaching 10% by 2010, creating jammed city streets in urban areas where, of course, most of the vehicle owners reside. And yet only 6% of Dar es Salaam families own a vehicle. Of the individuals who live in urban areas, over 60% take public transport. And if we stand back and look at the national statistics, only 1% own a vehicle nationwide. In addition to low national rates of ownership, Tanzania's per capita carbon output, 0.2 metric tons, still pales in comparison to the 15.5 metric tons in the United States or the 8 metric tons in the European Union. Yet, according to World Bank estimates, the 0.2 figure not only surpasses the nation's previous high in 1972, 1973, the peak you see there for total carbon output, but also reflects major increases in use of liquid gases such as gasoline and diesel that have accompanied private car ownership increases since the mid-1990s. By numbers alone, this growth seems to align with a phenomenon John McNeill and Peter Engolk call the Great Acceleration. McNeill and Engolk note that since 1945, quote, 3/4 of the human-caused loading of the atmosphere took place, end quote. The authors point out that this period of great acceleration implicates not just the standard colonial industrial polluters of Europe and North America, but also newer carbon-spewing economies of growth, particularly China and India. There's no doubt that the era of independence, including ideas of self-reliance in Tanzania, were bound up with polluting technologies and fossil fuels. But, and this is an argument in the book, and I want to expand on it today, it would be a huge mistake to look at Dar es Salaam's jam-packed streets since the 2000s, or rising private vehicle usage as an inevitability in a great acceleration with no historical off-ramps. Don't get me wrong, Tanzania's 0.2 metric tons of carbon emissions per capita still pollutes and destroys. But the quantitative gap between 0.2 and 15.5, the US number, or even the differences within Tanzania's own history of liquid fuel use from the 1970s to the 2000s, also reflects qualitative differences about the way societies create ideal worlds and react to historical changes. I thus invoke after socialism not to romanticize Ujamaa or uncritically apply its past to the present or future. Rather, I aim to use Tanzania's socialist technopolitics, particularly around automobility, as a provocation that opens space to explore the disjuncture between living and writing in a period marked by various spiraling unsustainabilities, with an increase in the analytical terms, such as the Anthropocene, that we have to describe this moment on the one hand, and the absence of global socialism's strident, consistent critique of private motoring and out-of-control automobility on the other. And in thinking about this, I'm wrestling with what a transnational anti-carism or an anti-automobility is. And I'm trying to think if there's another form outside of different manifestations of socialism for thinking about that is on a larger scale, anti-car and anti-automobility. And so I'm sort of just working back through this. With this in mind, I'll make the case that Tanzania's socialism provides a compelling history for at least for doing so and thinking about these things, or at least starting to think about them. Technologically and economically, Tanzania's version of African socialism is most often written off as a failure that has few applications to the present, and it's often described as a form of maldevelopment or of poor decisions made by bureaucrats that destroyed the road to socialism. And so there's often these sort of narratives of modernization's failure that inform a lot of descriptions of Ujamaa, and I try to take that on in the book. Those scholars have lauded Tanzania's father of the nation, Julius Nyerere, for helping build a durable and lasting political project. This success most often contrasts with the nation's economic and technological shortcomings during the first 2 decades of independence, both elements informing a linear decline narrative leading up to the eventual collapse of Ujamaa in the mid-1980s. I challenge this narrative in African Motors by showing ways in which citizens, the state, and even bureaucrats innovated in good, bad, and challenging times alike. Far from an inevitable failure, histories of car repair, urban mobility, and even oil trading point to African expertises in their multiples and across technological registers. These, I argue, offer evidence for writing African histories of development rooted in multiple technological practices, spaces, and competencies found in Tanzanian history, thus challenging a narrative of technological development and need that has shaped much of Africa's past. Today, I use after socialism, and including the difficulty of thinking about sustainability or car use after socialism, something that is truly critical on a big scale of it after socialism, to think about some different historiographic purposes. In particular, I want to highlight the ways that Tanzania's Ujamaa recognized the self-devouring nature of automobility from the get-go, and then sought ways to do things differently before and during economic crises. Sociologist John Urry, or the late sociologist John Urry, one of the founding scholars for thinking with and about automobility, writes that, quote, automobility, we might say, is neither socially necessary, nor was its development inevitable. But having got established, it seems impossible to break from, end quote. He's right in that cars and combustion engines will likely continue to operate for many decades, if not for centuries, in Tanzania and in Colombia, South Carolina, where I live and wrote much of this book, and where I might add that there are likely fewer political and cultural solutions to addressing unsustainability than in Tanzania. Yet, if automobility seems impossible to break from, I think lived experiences during Ujamaa offer much to think with and through in terms of thinking about how things could and might be done differently. So to tell this story, I'm going to start with the socialist tensions of automobility, and to start that story, I'm going to start in a garage. A staple of the Dar es Salaam music scene in the 1970s, Brian Abrique, pictured here, who played under the name Brian Shaka, aimed to mix influences from Jimi Hendrix and Sam Cooke. But Abrique is best known on city streets for building what the Daily News called the first ever car to be created in Tanzania. Constructed at his home on Undali Street, as the next slide will show, he called it Muungano, or the Union, because he formed it out of what he called, quote, pieces and pieces of 27 different vehicles. So this is where it's formed at his house, actually 2 different houses. These 27 different vehicles included motorcycles, bearings from small rail cars found at sisal estates, an engine block, piston and crankshaft from a scrapped Vanguard, pistons from a Land Rover, an electric pump from a Ford, and a speedometer from a truck. The finished product so impressed the party's youth league commander, Ardawani. So this is the finished product, and there he is with his son at a gas station. It so impressed the youth league commander that Dewani made an impassioned plea. Sorry, I missed a picture here. This is Dewani. The finished product so impressed the party's youth commander that he made an impassioned plea to leaders of Tanzania's socialist state to reconsider whose knowledge found uptake in nation-building efforts. He said, quote, "This admirable piece of workmanship serves as a pointer to the kind of future we can have if we shall take seriously the question of organizing imaginative and inventive minds." Dewani lashed at the bureaucratic tendency of glorifying certificates and the notion that expertise could only be gained or found in such official spaces, such as technical institutes or schools or ministries, and not in the homeside or street-side garages from which the Muungano emerged, commonly known as Gerajibubu, or muted or silenced garages. So this is sort of the backyard home garages, and then this is a Gerajibubu. Dewani's critique set the context for the next part of the story. Shaka found himself in the Daily News yet again, this time for his arrest, for failing to register his vehicle and thus running afoul of Tanzania's socialist politics and motoring. Like other socialist and communist nations, Tanzania approached motoring and its infrastructure, whether tarmac roads or fuel usage, or just the difficult idea of private motoring when trying to address social scale problems. As a source and driver of social, political, and economic rot, a cancer even that could compromise Tanzania's sovereignty and nation-building project at a critical time. There are unique aspects to this anti-car socialism, which I will mention shortly, but the new nation was part of a transnational project of anti-carism that, at the very least, consistently voiced skepticism, and in a very early historical time period before planetary scale destruction, consistently voiced skepticism about the role of private vehicles within a society. From Hungary and the Soviet Union to China, Cuba, and many other places, including Tanzania, private motoring was not only placed outside of proper socialist context, but was routinely framed as a destructive social, political, and economic threat by both parties in the states, a phenomenon perhaps best captured by this Hungarian comic featuring a motor vehicle working in tandem with the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Oh, me. None of this meant that sedans and private vehicles held no place in socialist or communist societies. They most certainly did. But that rather that conditions had to be met and political guardrails put in place to ensure private motoring did not reflect existing, that is, show people the truth about a society that was unequal, or create new forms of exploitation. Citizens also promoted and shaped socialist anti-car rhetoric themselves, albeit often as critiques of states and bureaucracies, not delivering socialist promises that had been made. Ibrique's tragic arrest grew out of those transnational tensions between motoring and socialism, but it also had specific Tanzanian flavors as well. Unlike the Soviet Union, Hungary, or East Germany, where productive processes led to various forms of people's cars produced by and for socialist citizens, such a project was out of the question in the first decades of Tanzanian independence, a situation which amplified the politics of private motoring. In 1963, President Nyerere connected motor vehicles to a political culture of what he called, quote, pomposity and ostentation, in an often-cited speech. In Dar es Salaam, adding that, quote, "This sort of pomposity has nothing to do with the people, for it is the very reverse of democracy," end quote. He later reflected on this early period when giving a talk in China in 1975 and added, quote, "Our idea of government and statehood was permeated by the idea we had seen at work, the colonial example. Thus, for a time, an African riding in the back of a chauffeur-driven car was to us a sign of our independence. We expected members of our government to act like the bosses we had known and took pride in their doing so. Gradually, however, we began to realize that the replacement of white faces by black faces was not what the independence movement had been for," end quote. The nation's official turn to socialism, Ujamaa in 1967, brought sharper focus to this issue. In the Arusha Declaration, a philosophical blueprint for African socialism, a section titled "Let Us Pray and Heed to the Peasant" connected the technological inputs required for urban automobility to the exploitation of the nation's rural communities, which was by far where the majority of citizens resided. Quote, tarmac roads, too, are mostly found in towns and are of special value to the motor car owners. Yet if we have built those roads with loans, it is again the farmer who produces the goods which will pay for them. What is more, the foreign exchange with which the car was bought also came from the sale of the farmer's produce, end quote. With cars and tarmac roads as the opposite of praying and heeding to peasants, classic hierarchies emerged not between capitalists and workers or feudalists and farmers, as much Marxist thought suggested, but rather through, quote, a position where the real exploitation in Tanzania is that of the town dweller exploiting the peasant, end quote. The nationalization of industries about 18 months later in 1969 amplified this rhetoric as bureaucracies and later energy crisis magnified sensitivity around fuel use through the 1970s. And this brought a ton of attention to the figure who's on the right of the screen here, which is the motoring bureaucrat. And this wonderful novel, Ngumu Kutani, talks about a bureaucrat who at the top left is a good bureaucrat working at their desk. He gets a car, and then by the end of the novel, he is destitute, and he has destroyed not just his family, but also has contributed to the destruction of the national family, playing on themes of Ujamaa, familyhood. And it all starts with the car, literally. It starts with the car. While in the 1960s, bureaucratic motoring constituted a worrying sign about a socialist project in its infancy, struggling to find footing among those tasked with leading it. Throughout the 1970s, politicians and citizens sort of morphed and began to discuss bureaucratic motoring as an immediate threat to two of the nation's ideological pillars, economic self-reliance and equality, and thus a task that threatened the entire project of Tanzania's sovereignty. It also took on this form of, it had relationships to contraband markets. And so just about any time that motor vehicles came up, they were discussed as potentially problematic, an important part of a socialist economy, but also a tool that could be used to undermine it. This rhetoric, I argue in the book, was quite often overblown, misguided, and misapplied, as Ibrik's arrest shows. After 6 months in prison, Ibrik received and declined multiple offers to work, and you could guess this, for government ministries and parastatals who wanted his talent. He said no and remained in a boo-boo garage, a space that many mechanics considered a vernacular expression of how socialist expertise could and should play out, and I'll get to that in just a second. One night, Ibrik's son awoke to the sound of his father dismantling the muungano with a hacksaw, leaving the only remaining piece visible today, a gate post that used to be a tailpipe. In the book, this serves as one of the many moments in which citizens, the state, and ministries wrestled over definitions of socialism and its applications to everyday life, or what scholars have often called actually existing socialism. Today, I'm going to go in a different direction, to write about cars and socialism in the present, which is a period defined by increasing unsustainability coupled with evidence and awareness of that unsustainability, sometimes feels out of place, as if the timeline got something wrong, the anti-car ideology is in the wrong moment. It somewhat feels writing about this. Ibrik is punished for running afoul of Tanzania's anti-motoring politics during a sensitive moment of nation building, even though he doesn't fit at all the mold of a nation-destroying bureaucrat, in a nation with some of the lower historic levels of greenhouse gas emissions. Before and during the emergence of automobility as a planetary harm, socialism linked private motoring to a social group scholars now call kinetic elites, or the economic elite whose mobility produces a ridiculous percentage of the carbon output and whose lifestyles are undoubtedly destructible and unsustainable on a planetary scale. Put differently, socialism identified and addressed the impact of kinetic elites. It sometimes went overboard, as I've just described, within and across national borders before climate change or the Anthropocene raised concerns about the relationship between automobility and planetary harm. Let me suggest that one does not need to romanticize socialism, and I certainly don't hope to, or Tanzanian socialism, both of which are subject to a variety of deserved critiques, to recognize that how bodies moved, in which vehicles, and how those vehicles were produced and maintained, and whose ideas they sprang from, were a core part of its missions and a core part of the conversations and questions that Ujamaa provoked over at least 2.5 decades. Much of the literature on socialism and communism has suggested that socialist automobility largely failed to emerge as an actually existing alternative to capitalist and Fordist approaches to movement. I don't think, and I say that I don't think with not a ton of confidence, but I'm going to go with it. I don't think that holds for Tanzania's search for socialist automobility for two reasons. First, discourse about the democratic nature of Ujamaa, a tenet that was certainly stretched and contradicted at times, invited in users and makers in a technological sense who felt empowered to position themselves as the creators of socialist technologies, socialist technopolitics, and socialist cultures of use that they defined from the street and from the garage. The state was not always happy about this, but it also largely failed to control it in ways that gave car makers, repairers, and this gave car makers, repairers, and users space to combine socialism and cars in novel ways on streets or in workshops. Put differently, Ujamaa offered capacious technopolitics that rewarded both material and ideological tinkering and modification and repair in the face of uncertainty. Second, Ujamaa's architects clearly sought to avoid a Fordist form of industrialization premised on mass production and consumption. I think this is really the thing that makes Tanzania's Ujamaa, and I don't know that it's said enough, that really makes it stick out as a true search for alternatives. This was not a tit for tat with Fordist forms of industrialization during the Cold War. Even when cars were used and appropriated, and they most certainly were, the idea of a mass-consuming and mass-producing automobile society was almost never, if ever, on the horizon. And thus, throughout Ujamaa, a variety of historical actors sought ways to rework the close relationship between automobility and development. And I'm going to get into elements of that story. I'm going to truncate a little of this just so some of you have time, I hope, to get to your next thing. So we're going to begin that story by returning to garages. When Dewani lashed at the bureaucratic tendency of glorifying certificates, he did so precisely because mechanics like Ibrik found themselves outside of state-based definitions and locations of useful knowledge. Since at least the 1930s, young African men like Ibrik charted alternative regimes of mechanical expertise by migrating to towns, as this mechanic did here, where they joined workshops in which tacit knowledge gained through touch, smell, and sound and movement was considered the most important marker of mechanical competency. Instead of classrooms or books, apprentices learned by repurposing parts and vehicles on the shop floor. Instead of tests and certificates, they staked their careers on the ability to react to changing economies of repair and to know about a dizzying number of makes and models. Often located, as Ibrik's was, under trees and at homes, their shops were not always easy to identify as garages. That's a Kiswahili name, Gereji Bubu, silent garage, suggests. Yet such mechanics created an accessible infrastructure of expertise through which unschooled men saw cars exposed, learned by doing, and found incentives for having what Douglas Harper describes as, quote, a mind that is not locked into established ways of seeing and doing, end quote. By infrastructure of expertise, I mean a material world of things, much like you see on your screen. In this case, spare parts and broken vehicles, which not only alerted potential mechanics to the presence of expert knowledge, but also did not stop their entry into spaces of esoteric knowledge production, as doors, walls, and certificates at technical institutes, the normative spaces and materiality of expertise often did. Already located in the intimate spaces of African life during the late colonial period, by independence in 1961, Bubu garages were also by this time called mtani, or street garages, emerged as such accessible infrastructures of expertise for young men and boys, some as young as 9, to pursue forms of expert knowledge production. The general structure here was to come in. The second you come into a garage, you're called a kijana or vijana, and probably some other names, the kijana and vijana marking either a singular youth or a plural youth, but they're generally glossed as just being young. And then one trades labor for knowledge and works through a number of different repairs, starting with the simple up to the complex. And they work for an individual, a mechanic who has knowledge and resources, is referred to as an uncle or an mjomba. To be an mjomba, you really do have to have resources to be able to offer that sort of fictive kinship that one can turn scrap into something. Just having knowledge on its own generally didn't work. And the whole idea was to be able to turn scrap and knowledge over years of training into an expertise that allowed one to then make claims on gendered adulthood, and to have a modification specialization that allowed one to go out and sort of have an individual form of self-reliance. For that form of self-reliance and gendered personhood to be available, Mechanics collected used parts and broken cars that they stored in various areas of their homes, living rooms, as in here, chicken coops, or even the trunks and seats of cars parked outside the garages. One mechanic said, quote, "We had people come to us and say, this is scrap. For us, it wasn't scrap. We see it as a spare to fix," end quote. As spare part shortages reduced the state's ability to import necessary parts for state and private vehicles in the mid-1970s, boo-boo shops became centers of repair for both state and private vehicles and produced a variety of African vehicles, which I will show pictures of in just a second. Though owners' preferences certainly mattered in this process, mechanics said they rooted modification and their conversations with owners about it in details about which type and model of parts worked together and about which parts and models they considered reliable enough to stake their reputation upon. And so here are a number of examples from more rural townships. A lot of this is just about, so the one on the left, you're extending the bus. This is actually what is necessary to put a new engine in a bus that's more reliable, had to extend the front of the bus. There's a number of work that happened with drive shaft components, as in on the right, upper right. This blue truck here was a Toyota, but has so many different parts on it that it sort of ceased to have what you might call a sort of predominant brand. But all of it kind of coming together. And that one on the bottom right was based around what worked best in a particular area in Tabora. And so it all been fine-tuned to sort of the topography and the needs of the owner. This process differed based upon location, especially given the absence of heavy machinery in rural areas. But the physical and intellectual labor of fitting different makes and models together facilitated the transformation of scrap or individual spare parts into a variety of African vehicles, a process I term unionizing, from Ibrik's example in Muungano, or the union, from the verb of bringing things together. As a technological act, unionizing repeatedly created something new through a term that mechanics called resurrection, or kufufua, which was a term mechanics likely used because they were not the first to create something out of most of the vehicles they saw, because the work often came from breakdown. If manufacturing constitutes the birth process of a vehicle, mechanics' use of resurrection insists production comes out of death and breakdown too, and for good reason. In addition to changing the material composition of part or vehicle, modification required the skill to see parts from different years, from different makes, from different models work together in a single resurrected thing. Douglas Harper calls this, quote, "seeing beyond the elements of a technique to its overall purpose and coherence," end quote, and considers it an ultimate form of expertise, equal if not higher to the forms of invention and production that populate histories of technology and development. So I'm going to go through that. I just put this in here. This was not always, and it was, in many cases, as Ibrik's example shows, this was not making do. This was also about joy and love and working with and in spaces where creativity was rewarded and where there was abundant material to think and to remake technologies and have the license to do that. So this is a Ford Zephyr with rocket boosters, and the speakers were on the outside. So that block on the left side there, that is a radio speaker, and this was a wedding car in Tabora. State media and the nation's president, Julius Nyerere, struggled with Gerejibu, often condemning them for their technologies, sometimes even putting out statements disbelieving that mechanical expertise could come from such spaces, bodies, and minds. I'll note that much interdisciplinary literature on development does the same, lowering and othering other bodies of knowledge in the material worlds as informal, as tinkering, as worlds of creativity defined less by their specialization than by a perceived rooting in conditions of economic precarity and desperation. From the shop floor perspective, however, mechanics saw Bubu and Mtani not only as a cutting edge of vehicle repair, but also as a durable socio-technical institution for their own development and for their nation's development. And I'll just note that these are all the places where I did either worked or did oral histories in garages. So this is not like a one-off that you just find in one place. It's found throughout Tanzania, and it's found across borders as well. In the book, I argue that such garages are just one example of the need to broaden the categories and materialities of expertise that count in the histories of development and technology, and thus challenge the pervasive myth about African skill gaps. Indeed, in the chit-chat after many of the formal interviews I had with mechanics, they often alluded to an alternative history of repair and innovation that they shot thought could and should have been more central to official development policies if only state institutions had adopted a different stance toward whose and what types of knowledge gained legitimacy for socialist nation building. More than a vague, if understandable, calls for recognition, such alternative histories were grounded in practical approaches to technological life in the 1970s. And thus were not just limited to Bubu Grages. Indeed, one of the state's best mechanics, one who trained in West Germany, called for government ministries to do what Bubu Grages were doing, which was to and to take it one step further by standardizing car ordering, thereby reducing the numbers of part and vehicle modifications mechanics would have to learn. And one of the things that mechanics talked about was that the ever-changing nature of part landscapes was a real intellectual burden. And so this mechanic wanted the state to just standardize it, and we'll be good to go, and we can make our own spare parts, and we can create a sort of technological and economic self-sufficiency. And he argued that doing so would consolidate what Tanzanian mechanics do well at scale, which was modify, while limiting the burden on those same mechanics to keep up with the proliferation of new makes and models. Today, I want to take up that alternative history for a slightly different purpose of thinking with the standardization of reuse and modification during good and difficult times alike. Though Gerji Bubu and modification predated socialism, during Udama, mechanics took the call for democratic socialism quite seriously and extended it to cultures of reuse and repair that kept many parts of the nation running during periods of economic constraint. Moreover, they creatively repurposed parts in ways that take repair and maintenance out of the constraints of a precarious making do or second best to factory mass production. And they built identities and training pedagogies around the challenge of designing and making in the context of emergency. Repair and maintenance, to be quite clear, are not an environmental solution to mass automobility, as I'm about to show in a video that makes this very clear. However, whatever non-fossil fuel sources gain traction in future policies, boom mechanics have and will stand ready to make them commensurate with car bodies and parts the nation already has. And in the context of the ridiculousness of Tesla and Elon Musk and all of our kinetic elites, and I say this with a little bit of disgust and a good deal of seriousness, they provide a way to think about technological creativity coming from the shop floor and from everyday work instead of through the powerful corporations invested in an automobility's destructive status quo and who also have been promising us false solutions to that status quo. So for this, this picture, which was on, I believe, the flyer, this is a garage in Dar es Salaam that's about 30 blocks wide. You can pick your car, pick your engine. And so I use after socialism a bit playfully in this sense to this tradition carries on, and you can create, you can go and pick and have a car made for you. Just, you get to pick everything at this garage. It includes many parts. It's huge. It also includes a foundry. So this is so this furnace runs off of used motor oil. And so all of the oil that comes through this then goes into running this this furnace. And what is being melted down, this was copper, but the previous day they had melted down an engine block that you see on the right. This was the one that didn't come out, but these are pulley levers that they're then selling. They're finishing these with lathe machine shops just up the road, and then selling these to local factories. And so cars are quite literally being melted down, and every part of them used from motor oil for the fuel to them finding their way into factory for other forms of production. Okay. From garages, let me move to the streets of Dar es Salaam, where socialist citizens, whom the state often denigrated, as Emily Clatchley, y'all's colleague, has shown brilliantly in her book. The state often denigrated citizens or the idea of urban Ujamaa as impossible. And yet, on the streets of Dar es Salaam, citizens forged an early and resilient form of mass mobility. They did so in partnership and conflict, a productive conflict most of the time, but definitely in conflict with a bus parastatal known as Usafiri Dar es Salaam, or basically Transport Dar es Salaam, simply known as UDA. UDA received lots of critiques and suggestions, and the chapter is built around citizens' dialogue with the state regarding bus transit in hundreds of letters to the editor. But this wonderful exchange sometimes minimizes the parastatal's accomplishments if we zoom out and think about sustainability and mass mobility. 2 years after its nationalization in 1970, UDA served nearly 70 million residents annually, increasing only 1 year later to 86 million, the equivalent of 180 bus trips a year for each of the city's 500,000 residents. By the end of the same decade, the bus pericycle estimated that it regularly served over 2/3 of the city's population, with one government study estimating that buses displaced walking and biking as the most common form of intercity mobility. If it did so, it was a blurb or a blip. It didn't last, but it was definitely a huge part of mobility. Even in the early 1980s, with half of its fleet broken, UTA moved between 100 and 120 million passengers every year, a 14-fold increase from the mid-1950s when this began as a fairly austere colonial development project. UTA accomplished all of this in the context of incredibly high urban immigration rates, including population growth rates of 40% between 1971 and 1977, which placed an incredible strain on its equipment. And of course, in a global environment in which the transfer of capital-intensive technologies and resources, buses, parts, and fuels, saw operating costs skyrocket after the oil crisis of the summer of 1973. Between 1974 and 1983, the pericycle received only 35% of requested foreign exchange through national budgets to use on repairs and purchases. And not surprisingly, by the late 1970s, UTA's documents show acute spare part shortages, and one wouldn't even need to look at those documents, just read the newspapers to know things weren't functioning as well as people wanted them to. Yet by moving passengers during hopeful and difficult times alike, the pericycle succeeded, I argue, in turning Dar es Salaam into a quite literal post-colonial space in a material sense. During the colonial period, racial zones divided the city by European, Asian, and African zones, 1, 2, and 3, respectively, and circumscribed urban mobilities and limited urban mobilities to zone 3, and then circumscribed them in zones 1 and 2 for at least the first 60 years of the 1900s. Early bus transport largely sustained this geography because it was designed to move workers from racialized residential zones to spaces of labor on the edge of the city. Yet, as the map shows, so you can see the city grow in population, and you can see how it grows around the bus routes. And much like Jennifer Hart's history of Accra and Kenneth Mutongi's history of Nairobi, bus routes facilitated the city's growth. By the late 1970s, 100 UTA bus routes cut across the former demarcations and connected peri-urban settlements to Dar es Salaam's historic center through a ring route that encircled the entire city. With subsidized tickets almost every resident could afford, UTA opened most of the city to most of its residents in ways that radically transformed urban mobilities. Residents initially had little say in these routes' design, but they made their voices heard about the placement and number of bus stops in newspapers. And this was particularly the case in terms of the peninsula that you can see jut out there, which was the former sort of home of Zone 1, the European zone, where there were numbers of calls to put bus stops because that had been a racially segregated zone, but also the center of private vehicle ownership. In this sense, UTA's coordination of road, bus, and station allowed Dar es Salaam residents to think about and experience their city in a new way, and they tried to influence its form. For a new generation of urbanites who had not lived under colonial rule, however, UTA buses were just a natural part of not only urban-built worlds, but also an integral part of city space and time, and just what it meant to be alive. And thus, in Sudi, a short story by Pili, which is a short story published in the Daily News, the protagonist gets lost in her thoughts as she rides an Icarus bus, which the Icarus buses were these Hungarian buses brought to be the basis of Tanzanian socialist mobilities, to simply clear her mind after a difficult stretch of life. Quote, luck was on my side. I got the UTA as soon as I reached the nearest bus stop. While I sat there holding steady, tightly the handlebar, and while the rickety Icarus dangerously negotiated the sharp streets of Dar es Salaam, my whole 2-year association with Sudi began to unfold before me like a motion picture, end quote. Thus, to live in the city was to have access to buses and mobilities and the mobilities that they provided, whether for work or to simply get space to think about a relationship. On the left, there were long conversations about queuing and time lost and socialist inefficiencies and what that would mean, and the citizens' burden for that and the state's burden for that. So that's the top left. And the bottom right, these are the Hungarian Icarus buses that were popularly known as Karusi, that provided sort of the vehicle that constituted the people's car of Dar es Salaam. UTA's shortcomings found their way into newspaper editorial pages where citizens made the case for a better functioning form of technological citizenship. for the city over at least 2 decades. They wrote about lost time, pushed back against the state's denigration of urban life, and called for the state to deliver better social service, a better service for the needs of both the city and the nation. But the action did not end there. Some residents repurposed private vehicles as buses, slowly turning them into a supplementary and parallel system of mobility. The state and party castigated such tumni, as they were called. They're now known as dala, and they are the city's largest public transit system. The state initially considered them to be capitalist exploitation. Enraged citizens took their leaders to theoretical tasks in letters to the editor. They argued that definitions of socialist technology came not from state categorizations about which vehicles did and did not fit Ujamaa best, but from the use value of a vehicle in everyday life. Furthermore, they argued for socialist cities and economies to work, bodies needed to move to and from both work and social activities. If that occurred in private vehicles being used in the service of Ujamaa, it offered something to build on, not criminalize. And they eventually won this case, although there were some consequences from it. But let me just take a step to the side and say, placed in the broader global context, decades before mass public transit took center stage in broader transnational efforts to reduce private vehicle ownership and their emissions, particularly through the 1970s after the oil crisis and in subsequent decades, residents of Dar es Salaam had already asked for and literally waited patiently for forms of mobility that would reduce automobile ownership in their city. When this did not work as planned, they took their private automobiles, few in number though they were, and knit them into a support system that responded to urban residents' daily needs decades before Uber or Lyft. They did so all in the name of keeping larger public infrastructural efforts alive. And thus dala are often misinterpreted as a neoliberal technology when they are indeed a very socialist technology. Such, quote, broken world thinking, as Stephen Jackson puts it, or we could use Brian Larkin's phrase, repair as a cultural mode of existence, needs to be recognized for what it is and what it was between the late 1970s and early 1980s. An effort by residents to repair a socialist city and its services with the assumption that parastatals and the services they offered were there to stay. While there was no guarantee that Citizens' solution would work, city residents were not anticipating the failure of their state or the arrival of free markets as a remedy to socialism's limitations. Instead, they thought deeply about infrastructural solutions to help make their city work better during crisis in order to salvage a state institution that provided urban technological citizenship on a scale that Thumni, even, and of course, even its proponents admit it could not do this. It could not provide anything on the scale that the state could. Put differently, passengers did not endorse the self-help approaches to urban planning popularized in the 1970s, which called for a reduction of state power, as officials themselves had feared. Nor did they valorize the local as some simple solution to the shortcomings of centralized urban planning, a theme often found in scholarly critiques of modernization. Instead, Dar es Salaam residents called for a hybrid approach in which the state and private operators addressed urban infrastructural crisis together, with the private answering to the state. Let me quickly move into the third example here, which is the shortest, and it will go straight into the conclusion. UDA's struggles were shaped in part by the financial pressures brought by energy crisis between 1973 and 1979. In the book, I spend a chapter, which is chapter 4, which I'm happy to talk about, exploring Tanzanian oil bureaucrats' strategies for procuring oil with no capital. My point there is twofold: that critiques of bureaucrats as compradorial agents of socialism or of African modernization is greatly oversimplified, as is the search for, or the notion that there were clear technological forms of appropriateness or technological roads that weren't taken that we can use to sort of lambast bureaucrats. And secondly, that Ujamaa, despite its very intentional search for alternatives to dominant forms of modernization, was still a fossil fuel form of automobility that required various forms of oil and automobile infrastructure, whether it's cars or buses or trains or oil pipelines or an oil refinery, all of which Tanzania had. All of those were needed to move bodies and things. I mention these arguments because they bring us to some of the alternatives that emerged in Tanzania in the face of fuel crises and subsequent economic and sometimes technological struggle. In response to the energy crisis, the city's 1979 master plan, which is pictured here, put forward a vision of the city that cemented historically low private vehicle ownership. Private vehicle ownership fell from 1973 by about 20%. And so throughout the oil crisis, we're actually continuing the socialist sort of project of decentering and private vehicle ownership, and which sought to reduce the city's reliance on diesel, which the buses ran on, for producing those mass mobilities. And it thus has proposed a large expansion of pedestrian infrastructure. And so the diesel, the legs are taking some part of what diesel had done up to that point. And I'll just point out here that the plan was to create these 10, that the 10-party cell was the structure of socialism. And so they were going to use that to create these plots, and you would have numerous forms of these neighborhoods that were 10 cell structures that would then have everything they needed: a school, a mosque, a church, a clinic, a market, so that people would be going downtown once a week instead of 3 to 4 times a week. So it was remaking the entirety of the city and the way that people thought about mobility in the face of the sort of economic crisis brought by the oil crisis of the 1970s. This was not a plan for environmental sustainability. Planners were not anticipating the Anthropocene. They did not need to. Fossil fuel-based mobilities, though an integral part of the city life, threatened economic sovereignty at 1970s energy prices. This economic threat of bus mobilities, in turn, had a political and cultural foundation in which both citizens and the state sought to do automobility differently. They didn't always agree over that, and they thus tussled over ways to do it better. But the tussling is something that I take a little bit of comfort in. This would involve more walking, more local living, and trips downtown only when necessary. The only part of the plan that came to fruition, however, was the pedestrian infrastructure. The rest of the plan's attempts to minimize automobility in the city and build around strategies forged through crisis, gave way to structural adjustment policies that arguably created a new age of motoring in Tanzania's short history, structured around increased roads and increased private vehicle ownership. These elements came not from Ujamaa, but from McNamara's World Bank. Within a decade of these policies' implementation, interestingly, the World Bank joined with the United Nations to raise concern about climate change. This is in 1992, a very early recognition of this, which on the one hand, I guess, a good job recognizing that. On the other hand, ironic that you're creating motoring economies 10 years earlier in Tanzania, and then 10 years later recognizing, oh, this is not sustainable. Within another decade, by the early 2000s, development organizations started talking about Tanzania as a place with too many motor vehicles, and thus a place that couldn't do automobility correctly. And this has been used to justify a number of interventions. So by way of a sort of a conclusion, international organizations tend to see emerging, this is the term used, emerging economies with low motoring rates as easy targets for redirecting the historical relationship between motorized mobilities, economic growth, and greenhouse gas emissions. And this is now one of the major focuses in terms of thinking about development. They do so problematically by approaching places like Tanzania as latecomers, and this term is used, instead of societies that put the car and society together differently. And thus the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and many others have funded projects to try to make Dar es Salaam's mobility more efficient and more environmentally friendly, often at the expense of existing vernacular solutions. Many city residents would like things to work differently, no doubt, but such projects conveniently and repeatedly ignore that Tanzania had policies in place to reduce both motoring and traffic for at least the first 24 years of independence, well into the 1980s, and that the policy U-turn that led to traffic and increased pollution stems not from a problem peculiar to Tanzania, as such projects often suggest, but came from ideologies that positioned themselves as the economic and political savior to socialism. I thus invoke Cars After Tanzanian Socialism to remind that the connection between urban citizenship and mass urban transit started with Ujamaa in the late 60s, that the desire to couple articulated buses with walking and biking first manifests in socialist urban planning, that the call for urban walking cultures is most starkly evident in other forms of urban planning, particularly in Dodoma, the nation's capital, where there was a real effort to reduce car mobilities, and that a desire for bundled infrastructure coordinated by the state, to reduce private mobilities, which is now the new turn that the World Bank is suggesting, was already a metric of citizenship for much of the city after independence. And some Ujamaa offered an explored alternative to the relationship between car and society that the motoring core has failed to recognize or appreciate. Again, my intent here is not to romanticize or replace one universal prescription with another. and certainly not to try to anachronistically talk about climate with something that had nothing to do with it at the time. Instead, Tanzania's motoring history confounds a lengthy past of external experts telling East Africans what their mobilities mean and how they should move. Moreover, as automobile historian David Kirsch observes, scales of use and an ability to or unmake socio-technical systems, two major components of the remaking described above, matter when assessing the environmental impact of automobiles. Cars have polluted and destroyed as linked parts of socio-technical systems, most often as constituent parts of mass-consuming societies that destroy environments in myriad ways. Greatly reduce the number of cars or usage, and they do much less harm. While that does not make cars themselves clean or green, it brings needed attention to the will and capacity of societies to unravel damaging socio-technical systems when they are identified as such. As political scientist Matthew Patterson observes, quote, "A world where cars represented individual freedom did not and does not exist naturally. The world can be remade without the car at its socio-technical heart," end quote. And with that, I am going to stop and open for questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Josh, so much. This was great. Unfortunately, I have to run. I would love to engage with you. I was thinking of Mozambique, where I frequented those silent garages of Cuba where cars are put together. So anyway, I had all kinds of questions, but unfortunately I have to run. I'll pass the baton to Jackie, and sorry I'll miss the conversation. Thank you so much.
Much least.
Bye, Luis. Thank you, Josh. Alexis, I don't know how long we have the room for, until 4.
Yes, 4 is correct.
Oh, okay, 4. So we have about a little bit under 30 minutes for a Q&A. Josh, thank you for this really fascinating presentation. I have a lot of questions, but I want to see if anybody in the room or online has any questions or thoughts. And if you're in the room, just feel free to come on up or raise your hand.
There's just 2 of us here in the room.
Hi, TT.
Hi, Jackie, Professor Jackie. I didn't realize this was going to be a Zoom talk, so I came over from my office.
No worries. So I can, throw out a few thoughts out there. I was really fascinated by the video where they're melting things down and so on. And I was just wanting to know, how is training done? Is this something that is there formal training or informal training for this? And is this something you only see in Tanzania? Because I've been to garages in Cameroon, but I've never hung out in them for hours at a time to see the behind the scenes. So I'm wondering if a lot of these methods are also used outside of your country of focus.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Jackie. I'm going to try to answer. The answer to your second question is I don't know. For one of the things that sort of caught my attention early on was garages. And though there's a really fascinating growing literature on automobiles and automobility, I think mine is one of the few to situate itself in garages. And so sort of waiting for others to do the work to really get a real comparative analysis. My impression is that there are, well, let me say it this way. I don't think there's, I once floundered at a job talk when I was asked the question, what is uniquely Tanzanian about this? And I just swung and missed as hard as I could. And it was an out-of-body embarrassing experience. And the answer that I should have given was the idea that Africans need to fix cars differently was a core part of the colonial project that was repackaged as modernization theory and many other forms of development theory. There are analogs to the way that Tanzanians fix vehicles in many other parts of the world, including the US, where the idea that you have to be schooled to fix a vehicle is fairly recent, even in the United States. But the myth is strong that you need to do it somewhere else, and that is a myth of the 60s and 70s and afterward. And it hangs over these histories. And so I think, to answer your question, I'd say I would expect to find many analogs. They are here in the US South, certainly in Cuba, certainly in the Soviet Union, even with a, I think, more draconian state, had these areas as well, as Louis Siegelbaum has shown. So, and certainly in just, I don't know if one can cite conversations with Kenyan colleagues who say, yes, this exists under the sort of banner of the Jewel Kali economies and technological spaces there. The training question, this is what I'm trying to unravel. I did not expect there to be a foundry. I had heard about it, and when I initially did research, it's not that I didn't believe it, but I didn't necessarily picture that, because I was watching the motor oil go out of the garages doing oral histories or working in them, and I said, well, where is that going? They're like, oh, well, they used it to create some, basically some bug-resistant paste that you put on the bottom of buildings, but also you can burn it and you can, run a foundry. And I was like, well, okay. So the training in that, the younger individuals in that foundry are trained just there by doing it. The guy who runs that was trained at a technical institute in Arusha, but he's one of 2 or 3 of about 3,000 individuals who work in this expansive garage who went to a technical institute. So by far, the training, the sort of what I've called infrastructures of expertise that are accessible, that Boo Boo Garages allow, that continues to be the case even outside of car repair, or even in an adjacent category such as sort of, melting down metals.
Can I jump in, Jackie? I had
Go for it.
Thanks. One was just a reference. Josh, you mentioned you weren't sure if anyone else had done research in garages. We had hosted a scholar a few years ago whose name I'm blanking out on, but she's an anthropologist who works on different soundscapes in Uganda. And she had like 3 that she focused on, and one was garages in urban Uganda. So obviously a different focus, but there might be something interesting in her work that would be useful for you. My question was about Kariako and garages there. I don't know if the one that you showed that where you could have your own car made was there, but there's sort of these urban legends in Dar about if you go to Kariako to get your car fixed, while it's being repaired on one end, thieves will be taking pieces off the other end to sell to other people. And I wondered, is that kind of thing just an urban legend or, a joke, or is that kind of thing happening as well? And is kind of, I don't know if thievery is the right word, but if this is like part of sort of the creativity and like making do with what you have access to and so on, or like the ubongo-ness of living in Dar is also part of this.
I think it is later. And then that's a good question. And in answering or in hearing, I realized I gave the most boring approach to this garage, which is just out by Tazara. It used to be downtown. And because it was downtown and too big, in 1996, the municipal authority said, you get out. And so the area where it is now was formerly a dump, Tabata dump. And so they cleared the trash out and then put up a sign that said, do not erect permanent buildings. And they've been there since 1996. And it is, just ginormous. And so it's sort of like a neighborhood unto itself, but one that came from, a form of sort of urban dispossession, from the downtown area out to an area that's considered to be less desirable. And of course, certainly there's a layered history to talking about people remaking cars with all the toxicities of the repair that was shown, on top of a former dump. And, you know, it doesn't help that when you come to this, there's a graveyard right to the side of it. So there's a lot of like metaphors of death and reuse and resurrection that come into the space. I haven't heard a ton about stealing. And that's a really interesting question that I'll have to ask sometime. The tendency is to put things into trunks. And so, and almost all garages have security guards of some sort or another. And they, I think your market question with Karaoke is really interesting. And it's a part of the research that I didn't feel like I got deep enough into in some ways, which were the difference between sort of the vernacular markets that mechanics created themselves and that they engaged in, which was sometimes a way to not engage, whether it was a formal socialist market or whether it's the even more complex markets of parts right now. And to give you an example of this, when one goes to order a part, you will be asked if you want fake or original.
Mm.
And so the fake part is coming from likely coming from China. And then original has a number of different categories. And you know, if a mechanic is to put on a fake part, they won't do it without the permission of the owners because they don't trust the fake part. And so you're sort of pulling in or referencing a longer history that I feel that there's a deeper history to than I provided in the book about the markets that mechanics made for themselves. And I kind of refer to it just in passing to sort of, you know, when historians get to the end and they have to make up 30 years to get to the present, you know, like neoliberal markets have been rough. And you know, that is exactly what they say. It was much easier during spare parts scarcity because we made our own markets and we could identify the things that we trusted. But I never heard an example of anyone's parts getting sold out of like a chicken coop or anything. But I'm sure it happened.
Can I ask a follow-up or?
Sure.
Yeah, since you mentioned, you know, that some of what I was asking about maybe came later after the period you're looking at, and also this idea that historians have to like bring us up to the present in their writing. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about your methods, like since you're obviously you did some archival work. I don't know if that was the bulk of your project and oral histories, but like some of it is contemporary, or at least it seemed like your methods must have been almost ethnographic or anthropological. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
So Katrina's question was one of my main questions about your methods and your oral interviews with these men. Where was the interview taking place? Was it in a bar? I mean, I just, you know, sort of paint a picture for us.
Yeah, there's a lot of oral history. So I'll sort of try to break it down. I think I ended up using about 215 oral histories across different chapters. So almost all of the ones that inform the garage chapter were in garages. And I worked in a garage that I came in and out of, and I probably worked for about a month of a 12-month period. And I was a really lousy mechanic, which ended up being a good thing because when I came into garages to do oral histories, there was excitement. There was like a finally. It was, you know, there was out of the hundreds of garages I walked into, there was one in Zanzibar where I was told to turn around and walk out, and that I knew the reason why. And I didn't know the reason why. I suspect, though, because in the other garages, they would say, okay, we're happy to talk with you, but are you a spy from Ford? They're not spaces where individuals are short on confidence. And it made it just a real joy to talk with folks about their work. And so I would say, no, I'm not. You don't have anything to fear. Here, you can call my mechanic and he'll let you know that you have nothing to fear. And so the call would be made. And so I did those types of interviews in a number of different places, as many as I could justify just in terms of the time of research. And almost all of them are in garages, and they all usually involve some version of personal archives. And so mechanics kept a lot of things. They almost always involved as well some form of trying to do a technological demonstration of sort. I moved through one where there's actually there's a video of a technological demonstration of an individual reborn an engine with sandpaper and a log in Tabora. And so what I tried to do was sort of think about oral history as, yeah, talking with people and getting histories, but also recognizing that material details matter to work, and that thinking with and through those through demonstrations and asking folks to show me how things were different then versus now, which of course created moments where you had older mechanics with an audience really enjoying the audience. But I think a lot of it checked out. And that was part of the, the burden of being an oral historian and part of the joy of being an oral historian. And so that was the oral history chapter, or the garage chapter. I then did interviews, none of them in bars, I don't think. No, they were not in bars. I was like, that could be an issue. With drivers. I just walked the streets of Dar and did a bus survey and just talked with people. I actually brought along old newspaper clippings and cartoons with me to take on the way that there was a real romanticization of the socialist period buses as a time of order and of the delivery of services that completely overlooked the contestation that had happened. And so I would use those and say, well, what about this? What about this? A lot about this, and bring those into the interviews. And so the bus chapter probably has about 40 to 50 of sort of a bus survey of where people went, what they did, and what it was like to ride the buses. But I sort of took that same approach to every part of it with, so urban passengers, but then also with drivers who were both in Dar es Salaam, but who then made the regional networks throughout Tanzania. I was trained by Laura Fair, of course, and one of, I think, Laura's really wise points is that you can write a book with Colonial or National Archives and say, well, there weren't any oral histories, and not do very much oral history work there, quite frankly, to suss that out. You can't do the opposite. And so I'm so thankful I was trained as a good oral historian, but also to be a curious archivist. And so a lot of the material came from going around different ministries and parastatals that hadn't sent their archives to the Tanzanian National Archives yet. And so I basically hung out in old government ministries and asked if they had stuff that they would let me look at. And of course, then there's the colonial dimension. The book starts in the 1860s, so there is stuff from the UK as well. But that's sort of the basis of it. And I tried to use oral history in multiple ways. And I tried as a historian of technology who's probably, well, I tried to get the link between orality and materiality, and to sort of use that as a way to see what could be done methodologically. And in this, they'll end here is, the sort of at its heart, there's a question of transmission chains with oral history. And that's not an irrelevant part of doing garage histories, where learning something from your mjomba is very much part of how you learn. I learned this because I come from this lineage. And so I was trying to unpack lineages of how different fixes were done. So trying to get to the level, okay, when did we start taking that carburetor and putting it in this vehicle? When did you start refinishing the top of an engine block by taking the windshield out and then covering it in sandpaper? Who came up with this idea? Okay, was it contested? And then going to basically the competitor garage on the other side of the city in a small town like Tabora and saying, what do you think of this? So just tried to sort of put it all out there and see what came.
It's an amazing project. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Josh. Yes, TT, go ahead and talk loudly.
Okay, can you hear me, Professor Grace?
Okay.
Okay, well, I'm TT and I come from China. I have a Chinese background, so I'm kind of interested in this historical entanglements between China and Tanzania. I'm not sure if it's your research interest, but if you could share some insights about maybe how Chinese investments in Tanzania infrastructure, etc., changed Tanzanians' people's sensibility about modernity, their citizenship. Well, this kind of topic, I'm not sure if you, if your research interests cover this area.
Well, that's the last good question to end with. Gosh.
I'll keep it within my area here, and I'll just say that there are other people who are much better at this, and thinking predominantly of Jamie Monson here. And let me answer this in a couple of different ways to try to sort of get at that intersection. One of the things I tried to grapple with was I think Tanzania has a much more interesting history of technology than sometimes comes to the fore, particularly around Ujamaa. And I really appreciate it. I'm not trying to be a Nyerere file here, as some Tanzanian scholars are accused. I'm not trying to be a Nyerere file, but I think he was a really smart technological thinker. And he very intentionally said, we can't do China, but we can't do Germany. We can't do the Soviet Union. And he said, we can't even do Romania. And he said this in sort of a shameful way. He said, we can do North Korea. And North Korea, what it was the combination of rural modernization and rural electrification. And what I really appreciate about that was Nyerere is thinking about these different socialist and communist models out there, and where Tanzania fits for what is for him to be a form of a scientific socialism. Now he changes every 18 months, as do a lot of people in such positions. But certainly China was one of the places that Nyerere thought with and through, both in terms of what Tanzania could and could not do. And of course, so there's a great book, Africa's Freedom Railway by Jamie Monson, about the Uhuru corridor that includes the Desire Railway, that is the sort of Tanzania-China partnership. What's interesting with that, with motor vehicles, is that the factory that they build to do that ends up becoming a spare parts factory for Isuzu trucks, as the state basically co-ops boo-boo modification techniques, and that is where they start to enact it. And so it provides a space, certainly, for the Tanzanian state to sort of try to pivot. A couple little moments from that I will always remember from conversations with mechanics is the appreciation of affordable technologies. That there's a sort of, there was sort of almost like ascribing this sort of South-South technopolitics to China, albeit in an era of neoliberalism, that China has recognized that people don't have tons of money, and that is a good thing, and it was often, at least in terms of personal consumption, considered to be something that was praiseworthy, even though some mechanics stayed away from some of the cheaper Chinese parts that were coming out of factories and sold at low prices. The final thing I'll say here that I find that is part of this project that I haven't quite wrapped my head around is, I think, and I'm still checking on this, the World Bank, when the World Bank takes over or sort of pushes aside the state and says, we're going to take over some of the planning and we're going to pick the winners and losers in terms of planning, they actually freak out for a moment. And they freak out in two ways. They freak out over energy economies, because the Tanzanian state had been doing real yeoman's work getting energy without capital, and the World Bank and the UN realized that there's no market fix for that. You need a state to do that. But the other thing is, they then want to just create this vast network of roads, and they begin that project in the 1980s. I think China is the one who finishes it. And so the Belt and Road Initiative that has garnered a good deal of attention, I think, is actually the 2 to 3 decades project of World Bank-based automobility, that they saw as the solution to what they considered to be the failures of Tanzanian socialism. And so it's this sort of ironic story of McNamara's World Bank, creating this need where it didn't really exist. But then, of course, it seems to me that China has come in and, yes, put their own initiatives on top of that. But I think the first domino to fall there in some ways was the World Bank really being concerned that they couldn't create markets without moving people or without a different infrastructure. And so that sort of starts it. But that's a meandering answer to a good question. That deserves a better answer.
Thank you so much, Josh. We are around almost at the end of our time here, and I just wanted to thank you profusely. I love your book. I taught it when I taught African popular culture, a couple of chapters, and students were just fascinated that they could better understand, African cultural expressions through cars. And so anyway, so thank you so much, TT, Katrina, Anihi, Rosemary, Adiola, Alexis, thank you. And these things are always awkward when you sign off. Like, do you just sign off, or like, what do you do? So,
Josh.
Thank you all. I
thank
appreciate
you.
it. Of course.
Bye, everyone.